Good day to you, viewers, wherever you are. Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere. Today we are going to be discussing a couple of hypothetical situations. What if? And what if it was the truth and it was hidden from you? We get to know from history what the triumphants want us to know. Things could have been different and may have been different, but you've been told otherwise. Um, Mary Magdalene, was she the real founder of Christianity? And because she was a woman, we were told men were responsible of that. We'll find out today, chatting to Ed Dodge. Good day, Ed. How are you?
Hi, Hanney. I'm doing great. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming back again.
Your new intro looks great. The show is you're stepping it up. It's looking good.
Yes, we're every year we're trying to jazz things up a bit, and stagnant things, according to evolution, will die off. So you need to evolve.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Good job.
Interesting conversation. I mean, I was very excited to have looking at your website. And by the way, folks, Ed's new website and YouTube channel are in the description of the video. Quite interesting subjects. Ed, you're not afraid of getting into controversial stuff.
Well, let's see if anyone even wants to talk to me. So, but yeah, we're trying to get into some different topics for sure.
It's very interesting. I mean, you've probably heard my intro about history and how history is written. And I always approach history with a bit of suspicion and skepticism.
No, you're absolutely right. Written by the winners, right?
Yeah. So do you think what reaches so far is entirely true? Or are you suspicious sometimes to the stories we have at hand?
Well, we know for sure that the church fathers were authoritarian and that they had a specific set of beliefs, and that they were intolerant of any other beliefs. And we know from their own writings that there were a lot of other beliefs floating around in the first couple centuries. And so, scholars are going to debate, what Jesus really said. I don't think anyone can really know for sure. But the fact that, we found these old texts, we found these Gnostic texts, the ones that the church fathers were. It used to be that we never had the text. We only heard what the church fathers had to say about them, like Eusebius and some other early writers, and they were always disparaging. And they're always disparaging the the Gnostics and any of these other pagan traditions, but you never heard from their perspectives, until recently. And so then they found the Nag Hammadi library, which were these texts that were buried in Egypt in the 4th century, at the time that that Orthodox Christianity became the state religion of Rome. And so they, ban everything else with like hostility and violence. And so some of these, Egyptian Gnostic monks presumably buried these texts to keep them hidden. And they remained buried for like 1600 years, from like until 1945 they got found. And then they were only translated for the public in the 1970s. So it's all really pretty new stuff by, biblical standards. And it's all these non-canonical gospels and all these sayings of Jesus that are really remarkable. And this presentation of Mary Magdalene, well, the two things that are remarkable to me is the presentation of Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles and her big rivalry with Peter. That is like, because that shows up in a bunch of them. That's pretty remarkable. But also a lot of talk about the Divine Mother and all this, endless talk about where, it's not monotheism. There's a lot of alternative theology to the whole thing, to the Gnostics, which is a very complicated subject, sort of a deep dive to go into it all. But the point is that it's an alternative theology altogether. So who knows how things might have been different.
Yeah. One thing about Christianity, when Jesus was crucified, it was never really clear. It wasn't a very clear message. Even during his life, his disciples never really understood him. Most of the time, he was speaking in allegory and in parables. So he was never really well understood. It's not until Paul have sort of tried to sort of make sense of things and declared certain creeds. I've always said I would love to be a fly on the wall, seeing how the Gospels were canonized and chosen, because I'd like to see the criteria.
Yeah, I mean, if you read, it's funny about Paul is that he never actually met Jesus. Here's the guy who founds the whole thing, and he never actually met Jesus, and he has his own Gnostic revelation. I used to be very critical of Paul. I've sort of come back around a little bit on him in the sense that he's kind of the first Gnostic, because he really just thinks of his own ideas. There's no authority for him at all. He just totally makes up his own thing out of the blue. So if he can do it, why can't other people do it too?
Do you think Paul is as chauvinist as he's made out to be? Because Bart Ehrman doesn't think he was that chauvinist. He was just a man of his time.
Necessarily all that chauvinist. I think the men that came later are way more chauvinist.
Yeah.
There was a lot of women around in the first generation.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was just that particular time, things were like that. But there were outspoken women. There's always in every era. And, the witches of Salem, I think they were just nothing but outspoken, smart women. Yeah.
This is part of my thesis about these traditions of the mother extending all the way through human history. And that with the rise of monotheism, they really get repressed. And you see the repression through the history, including witch trials is one part of it. And it extends all the way through today and right into our today's culture wars, where these religious reformations have never stopped being fought. Like our cultures are still fighting these old fights. Like it's still with us today.
Let's just zone in on Mary Magdalene a bit, because she's the subject of our conversation today. Yeah. But where she's the symbol of feminism here, surrounded by a bunch of men. Interesting narrative, because one of the things that the likes of Bart Ehrman and Robert Price will be talking about is when the tomb, Jesus' tomb, there were women there, and maybe an angel or two, depends on what Gospels you read. But there were women.
I wrote a whole piece on swoon theory. I'm actually have taken a pretty strong position that the most straightforward reading of the whole text is swoon theory. Is that, and I think that they're sedating. When they give him the wine vinegar on the cross immediately before he expires, that it's a sedative, and they're knocking him out, and then they take him down off the cross before he's dead. They patch up his wounds and leave him, under sedation to sleep for a day and a half, and then they revive him. And that's my position on what happened, assuming it even happened at all. But the women are central to the whole thing. It's totally the women that they're not just witnesses; they're responsible for the resurrection. It's their hands completely. They make the mystery potion. They administer it to him. They're the ones who pull him down off the cross. It's the women that bandage him up. It's the women that do the entire thing. The women they know Jesus' most important secrets, including the secret of how he rose from the dead. It's the women that are central, especially Mary Magdalene, who's the apostle to the apostle, and then they describe her as such in the Gnostic texts.
So give us a glimpse or two about the Gnostic text, and how was she depicted in Mary Magdalene? Was she as dominant as made out to be?
So the one there's a gospel of Mary Magdalene, but it's heavily fragmented, and we only have pieces of it. But the chunks that we have are pretty revealing, and I put the entire thing on my website, so you can read that whole text unadulterated. And then I've got the links back to where I sourced it from. And it clearly describes Peter saying, first Peter says to Mary Magdalene, Jesus loved you more than the others. Although I don't want to misquote it here, and then he says, tell us what he taught you, because he didn't teach us. And then she goes into like a vision and says, I saw Jesus and here's what he told me. And then the men respond, both Peter and another man respond that these are very strange things, and why should we listen to her? And then Peter says, did Jesus really speak to a woman and not to us? Why did he speak to her and not to us? And he's very angry about it. And then another man talks him down, and the other man says, well, if Jesus loved her more than us, and that's just the way it is, basically. You can read the whole text on my website. I don't have it in front of me. But clearly, and I remember thinking this as a kid, like Mary Magdalene was totally clearly, even in the conventional, the biblical gospel, she's clearly closest to Jesus. And yet she just totally disappears from the traditions, like from the Orthodox traditions. And it seems very suspicious that, she doesn't have a career like in the book of Acts. Mary Magdalene should have been there all along. So it's a very clear omission to me, just as a casual observer of Christianity, that she had a bigger role to play in the early days and was purged out for political reasons, basically.
Yeah, I mean, she enters the scene as a sinner, and this is when were first introduced to Mary Magdalene. But for a sinner female is always in that particular era and today is usually linked to prostitution. But there's actually a mention of her being a prostitute. Was it?
Well, that's not in the Gospels. There was some pope in the Middle Ages who described her as a prostitute. But you're right about the intimation that's made, and they say that Jesus drove 7 demons out of her.
Yeah.
That's in one of the Gospels. I take that to mean, I think this is my possible interpretation, because I call it Gnostic mystery Jesus, that she's tainted with mystery religions. The mystery religions were the biggest pagan traditions of the era. They were very well known. It wasn't like these were some obscure cult. These were like the big religions, the big cultural traditions of the day. And they were women-led traditions, and they're women-led traditions about dying and rising gods, where a goddess brings back, the dead god, and that restores nature and the turning of the seasons. And there's a whole series of these traditions. And they involve the use of plant drugs and psychedelics to taste, a death before death, and have these, rituals to prepare people for the afterlife. And so my take on it is that she could very well have been, had at least some involvement, even if just informally. It's like, it's in the same town, presumably she had to just walk down the road, even if it's not her culture, even if it's not her like community, it's still like readily available to her. And these are women-led traditions. So the sort of knowledge that gets spread from women to women about plant medicines and that sort of thing, and midwifery, and these types of women knowledge, that is all wrapped up in the mystery traditions. And so my story is describing that the resurrection is that the women did it. Like I said, the women are responsible, but it's like the mystery religions. The women are raising the God up. They're raising Jesus up from being a man into a God. It's the women that are doing it through this ritual of, death and rebirth. And, I'm making it all up. It's all just a what if thought experiment. But that's why I call it Gnostic mystery Jesus, because like, if you track these two things together, you get this whole different perspective on what Jesus might have been. And I don't think it's unreasonable to imagine that these women who are being criticized and who are sinners may well have at least had some tacit periphery experience with mystery religions that were going on all around them.
Yeah, it's interesting because even it's sort of been betrayed in the Bible and the Gospel that when Jesus was being crucified and all these issues around him, most of his disciples were sort of denying him or running away, and women were actually sticking around, doing all the hard work, yet sort of subtle. They're not well spoken about. They're sort of in the background doing their own thing, but they're always there. They're never away from the scene, while the guys in the limelight, but really doing very little, like denying him and doing all sort of things, betraying him, and causing all sort of trouble. And the women are sort of consistent. I want to ask you, Mary Magdalene and the physical contact with Jesus. I think it was depicted in the the Jewish tradition of washing of feet, and Jesus is sort of being not sort of being made to be interested in sexual or even emotional relationship with a mortal, because he's here for a job. But there's a lot of stories have sort of been later on spun around this relationship, what it could have happened.
Yeah, a lot of right. There's always been speculation about a romantic or sexual relationship, or were they married? I mean, Da Vinci Code is that that they're married and have children. I don't actually think that there's any convincing evidence of that at all. The way I read the Jesus story is that Jesus is chaste, that this is a chaste relationship. It's a student-teacher relationship. That's the way I read it. I think I think Jesus' sexual ethics were very traditional and conservative, and that if he was having sex with her, he would have been married to her, and they would have said that they were married. I just take it at face value that it was a chaste relationship. And the text that, the passages that have him kissing her are not necessarily revealing that it's romantic at all. That could just be a greeting, So I think the relationship is chaste. I just think that think if Jesus was talking about sex, he would have been talking about sex, and I don't think he is. So there was plenty of other religions of the day that were talking about sex. So if like they were worried about sex, they would have go over there. I think a big part of Christianity is that it's a sexually chaste religion. I think that's actually part of the appeal. I think it's part of the appeal for women at the time. I think at that era of the pagan religions, women are getting pushed around sexually. They've lost. Part of my thesis is that farther back in time you go, the more rights women had, and the ritual prostitution served women back when you go closer to the Neolithic, because the women kept the money and the women had authority and power. But by the time you're thousands of years later in late paganism, in like the Roman era, at this point, the women have lost all their rights. And any ritual temple prostitution is like, it's not benefiting the women anymore. They're just sex slaves, and it's like prostitution like we have nowadays. That's the way I see it. And so I think in the 1st century or in the 4th century, whatever, because women were clearly attracted to early Christianity. Like you were mentioning before with Paul, there's a lot of women around, and then they get shoved off stage. I talked to Robert Price about this. I'm actually supposed to talk to him again soon. He had mentioned this, that like there's all these women around, and then they basically cut the mic and like kick them out. And so by the 2nd, 3rd century, like the women are out of the picture altogether. But in the 1st century, they were very clearly there. And so yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought, but yeah, it's about it being sexually chaste. I think that was part of the appeal. I think that the women had been losing their rights and going to a religion that was really going to preach monogamy, because in those days it was monogamy for women but not for men. So like the idea that they were actually going to hold the men accountable sexually, and that they were not going to be encouraging them to all being completely promiscuous, I think that was part of the appeal. That's my interpretation of it.
Ed, I'm not very sure if you know about this. Thanks, Medalia, for the super chat, but it's a question that I am not familiar with, and hopefully you are. But if we are not, I'm going to be taking this upon myself to find out.
I'm not like the most detailed scholar of like ancient texts. For me, it's what I have to offer is like my interpretation of these stories. I'm not the guy who's like who's I don't read ancient languages, or like for me it's how I interpret the stories. That's what I'm trying to bring to the table.
Yeah, but it's quite consistent that you'll find different writings throughout different eras with multiple changes in the way people saw things. Then it's I'm not shocked.
There's a Gnostic apocryphon of John. John was a really popular character for the Gnostics, and there's a ton more material about him in the non-canonical Gospels. And there is some really, really fun. There's one story where he goes to Ephesus, and he goes to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, which, if you're familiar, was the one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was the biggest pagan temple ever built, biggest, grandest, most elaborate pagan temple anywhere in the world, and it was a major pilgrimage location. It's a spot where Paul goes to in Acts, and he starts a riot about, great is Artemis that they're rioting. They almost kill Paul. But at any rate, in one of these, it's called the Apocryphon of John or something, or the Apocalypse of John. He goes to the Temple of Artemis, and like he brings it down with his words, and he kills the priest with like the falling timbers, and then John, he raises the priest up. He resurrects the priest with his like magic, and then all the followers that were there, all the pagan followers, they all convert on site and start praying to Jesus and to John because of what they saw him do with his magic powers. So like that's a pretty fun story, and I wish that had been included in the regular Bible.
John's Gospels, we all agree, is the most interesting out of the all 4, because the high Christology thing, the language is written in a different way. It's a lot more. This is where Jesus is really super confident, knows exactly what
really divine. Yeah.
And
John's Gospel is definitely the most beautiful, the most lyrical, the most fun to read, for sure.
Yes, the other ones are like they're more like historical events and stuff like that. But John, for me, is the most interesting. Back to the females in the background. So this is where we're talking about a transition period. We talked about an era where the matriarchal societies and female goddesses were prevalent, and males were still there, but maybe inferior or equal at some point. But this is where a transition is happening now. So where Judaism is coming in, the Bronze Age, there's war, men are sort of reigning supreme at this point, but there's still residual elements of the past. The women used to be something, and you can see that until they get completely subdued at a certain stage.
Yeah, you see them losing their rights over an extended period of time, but it doesn't happen completely at once. But then, when Christianity takes over in the 4th century, then like the wall comes down, like the Iron Curtain comes down pretty hard. But that had been building for a long time. What I'll be talking about something I'll be writing soon is Epic of Ishtar, where I take the stories of Inanna from ancient Sumer, which is like the beginning of the Bronze Age. And then she's the young goddess. And then the stories of Ishtar from Babylon, which is 1,000 years later. And then the stories of Astarte from the Old Testament, which is yet another 1,000 years after that. But it's all the same goddess, and how you see the rise and fall and eventually being deposed there in the Old Testament. And that's for the Hebrews. But then the goddess worship doesn't go away completely, because there's still pagan cultures on the whole. And then it's at the end of the Roman era when it's like another 1,000 years, and then they really knock the goddesses out completely. But they were still around even when the Muslims got started, because Muhammad was contending with this as well, with the daughters of Allah. And so that shows up in the Quran. So, they never completely went away. And we still talk about Mother Earth now. So she never completely went away.
Yeah, it's funny about Muhammad's situation and the issues with women, and how women's rights are completely sort of were made void in Islamic doctrine. But even Muhammad himself, his first wife, he was only 25. And she was 40, and she was a very rich woman, and she was quite influential. And Muhammad is one of the things he's known for is his many wives and concubines. But during his first marriage to this great woman, who was very strong, he was never able to take another wife during her lifetime until she dies. So right. It tells you that women, when they're strong throughout.
Yeah, and I'm sure she was a huge assistance to him. He's got this rich cougar wife, and she probably helped him along his way in a huge way. And then, so she dies at some point, and he's able to move on.
Yeah. So once she's dead, then he was able to take the multiple wives. You see, in Islam, you can have up to 4 wives, but Muhammad was given a special treatment, and there's a Quranic verse giving him license to exceed that limit.
So how many did he have?
How convenient. Up to 13 at one time, but more than that throughout his life. And obviously Aisha, who was a controversial one, engaged at the age of 6, and consummated the marriage at the age of 9.
Right.
Which is, a bit of an issue. Yeah.
How many wives can a modern day Muslim have? If you're like a sheikh?
4. 4 and a right-hand possession. The right-hand possession are the concubine that you can capture in a war, in a holy war.
You can only have one of those, though.
So you can have 4 wives and unlimited amount of the
unlimited
concubine. Right. it's crazy. There's no limit to that sort of thing, but it's obviously it's frowned down upon now. First of all, you got to be rich, because these are 4 households. So we're talking about you can't be poor.
Most Bin Laden's father, didn't Bin Laden's father have like a ton of wives and like?
Oh yeah. Well, Bin Laden's were a rich family. These were Saudi families were involved in the oil industry as well. So they were stinking rich. But I'm talking about the average Yemeni or Somali or Egyptian who is just struggling.
Would you really want to have 2 wives in the modern day and have 2 households to take care of? I mean, that's pretty tough for that middle class among us.
Yeah, it's modern people are, actually it's delayed marriage. If anything, people are not marrying until the age of 30. It's a zeitgeist. It's a world phenomenon. I think it's going to cascade everywhere, where people are delaying marriages, and one is going to be enough for or not marrying and being a polyamorous, and being free, and that's becoming a thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, the rules are breaking down. We're into very uncertain times, and so people are starting to experiment with all sorts of models. And I don't really think there's any right way specifically to properly raise children as long as they're loved and their needs are being met. I don't think there's any one specific rule that it has to be nuclear family or something.
Indeed. So we go back to Mary Magdalene. The story and her gospel. Did you notice? You've noticed that she was the chief of all the other disciples. What gave you that impression?
I mean, I believe it's used as a title, the apostle to the apostles, or else that it's so common in the literature. But no, there's multiple, and I quote them in the story. I'd have to look it up, but you can see there's multiple references there where they describe her as, he loved her more than us. There's multiple passages that say that, refer to that she was the closest to him.
But isn't it very
In the
interesting?
Gnostic Gospels.
Yeah, but every gospel writer, obviously, they were not really the writers. John didn't write John, Mark didn't write Mark. But for some reason, whenever there's one gospel that's attributed to a certain author, he happens to be, in John's his beloved disciple.
Well, John certainly does it. John certainly adds himself in. No, that's fair enough. It's a fair point. We don't have really precisely clear dating on any of this stuff. Scholars think that, these texts were buried in the 4th century, but they're Coptic copies of older Greek texts. And scholars think that at least some of them are contemporaneous with the oldest, canonical gospels. And that, and clearly, even from the writings of the church fathers, we know that there was a lot of different books floating around that the church fathers didn't like. So I do think that, Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas in particular really do read like they're the sayings of Jesus. I mean, again, I can't say for sure, like if they weren't written 100 years later, but they sure read like they're just like the other, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They really, I mean, it's the same. It's very similar language, very similar feel. It's just that the theology is completely different.
Yeah.
And so it just makes you wonder, like, what was this guy really saying? Like, what was really going on?
But there are some modern movies that depict that sort of situation now, and I'll give you a bit of an analogy. So you get a movie, and there's like 10 different characters, and you see it from the vantage point of the main actor. Then the entire scene is repeated again from a different point of view, the point of view of one of the different characters involved, and the camera angles have changed. And that particular person being in the limelight could actually be making everyone feel special in their own way. So everybody goes around narrating. I was his favorite because at that point you connected maybe an eye contact, maybe a touch of a hand, and saying you're going to be something, whatever. And you take it as a person and you go, my God, I must be his favorite. And you start writing about it from your own point of view, which is obviously going to be a biased one.
Yeah, sure. But even in the canonical gospels, the women are very close to Jesus. As you're mentioning, the part where Mary, it's not sure which Mary it is, but that anoints his feet. And he says that she's preparing me for burial. And, his relationship with, there's a bunch of different Marys, Mary of Bethany, and her sister. So he keeps coming back to the women. And yet we know that culturally, it's a very misogynistic, patriarchal culture, and that all the gospel writers were men. As we know clearly that, the Orthodox is all men, and the approved canon is all approved by men. And so all references to women are minimized as much as possible, which makes all the references that are still there that much more important and notable.
Well, with Judaism came a put in place situation for women, starting from the 10 Commandments, where women were, together with the chattel and the house. Do not, wish for somebody else's possession, and women were clubbed in there, and that was a sort of a first feel of things to come. And then you have all these weird laws against women. The situation where a woman is trying to stop a fight between two men and touching somebody's genitalia by accident, which is bizarre.
Deuteronomy 25:11. It's my favorite of the old bizarre Old Testament laws, man.
I mean, who would come up with that? It's incredible. It's like, who would come up with that?
Right? How do you even think of that?
Such a trivial.
It's such a bizarre context. If a woman if two men are fighting and the husband and the wife of one man grabs the genitals of the other man that he's fighting, you must cut her hand off. Her own husband must cut her hand off. And it says, you shall have no mercy. It says, show no mercy in the text.
I think I have my own theory, Edward.
Okay.
I think it's been put there for non-comparative reasons, because some men don't maybe measure up and they go, bloody hell, I don't want her to touch somebody else. And she'd know that I was actually small. So maybe that's the reason. It's a very strange verse. It just makes and the harsh punishment for it. It's bizarre, but it gives you an idea of how women are going to be treated from here on end. Christianity, especially in the life of Jesus, doesn't do that. He's quite sort of balanced in his approach to both.
He's quite kind to the women. He's quite open to them, quite kind. He really seems to have good relationships with them. Is quite open to speaking with them publicly. So defends them publicly when they're, the woman accused of adultery and the Samaritan woman. Like, these are all like women that were in the Jewish context, not reputable women. And yet Jesus is talking to them all. So yeah, he really embraces them. I wanted to mention one more thing from Deuteronomy, though. There's also the laws about your daughter shall not be a Kadesha. So the Kadesha were the priestesses. They were the temple. They call them temple prostitutes, but they were really, the holy ones and the priestesses. And so you've got a law saying, like, we're putting you out of business. Like, they're not going to have these rituals at all anymore. So that's, just one more data point of like the women losing their rights when this is like the end of that whole tradition being shut down.
Yeah, but you see, probably around. I'm just putting my thinking out here. It's only we get to know that sex is linked to sin and being filthy and horrible thing with the monotheistic religions. But beforehand, you would think this is the act of creating life. It's somehow sacred. It's not filthy.
That's exactly what it was. It's exactly my argument about the Divine Mother. The Mother is these cycle of life traditions and life, death, and rebirth traditions, and they absolutely celebrated women's sexuality. I mean, Ishtar, the most popular goddess of the entire Bronze Age, was a prostitute. And they celebrated women's lascivious, non-monogamous sexuality. And that's part of the traditions of the mother. And so when traditions of the father throw the mother out, they throw out all these traditions as well. And then anything that's even going to remind you of the mother gets persecuted ever from going forward. So any kind of women's sexuality, but also gay sex, the transgender people were the high priests. Like, they had a very important role in all this. Men would castrate themselves. Like, they were the trans people of the ancient world.
I'm getting messages from some woke people saying, sorry, Ishtar wasn't a prostitute. She was a sex worker.
Okay. Putting hair there, it seems like that.
Paul, we don't think he's as chauvinist as he was made up to be, but he still put some new things into the Christian doctrine, depicting Jesus to be the head of the church, and man is the head of a woman, and women should not speak when they're in church, and they should cover up. Here are some hints. First, for the first time, things that Jesus never uttered, never said, never indicated in any of his actions. And this guy comes, supposed to have met Jesus in the road to Damascus via vision. He was a persecutor, didn't change his name. People saying he's changed his name from Saul to Paul, which never happened. That's his name in Greek, and that's his name in Hebrew. But he brings these two or three things, putting women in a slightly different category, inferior to men. Why is that?
Isn't it the case, though, that particular passage isn't that one of the passages they don't think Paul actually wrote? That was added on later.
Correct. So apparently there's 13 letters, and out of the 13, only 7 are authentic.
Right.
Yeah.
So, again, I believe that passage you're referencing is one of the ones that was added on later. So, which goes back to what we were saying before about like the women getting the mic cut. Like I think the women are friendly with Paul, and I don't think Paul's shutting them down at all. I think it's other men that come along after Paul that shut the women down. That was my sense of it.
Yeah, but it's still the point still remains. I mean, Paul to us is not just Paul. It's the collective thinking of the time. So maybe this has progressed a bit, and then the patriarchs of the church.
Your point though is that it's exactly not what Jesus taught, which that's a point well taken. Thanks, Gnostic informant. Thanks, Neil. So it's a point well taken that Jesus is explicitly friendly to the women, and then the Orthodox traditions are explicitly not friendly to the women, and that is something we should take note of, and everyone should be aware of. That alone is very clear, even from a conventional Christian perspective, without even reading into the other texts.
I'd like to say hello to my great friend Neil. Thanks very much, guys. Check his channel out. I'm going to be hosting him very soon, in the next 10 days or so, and I'm going to appear on his channel. I think the Derek, Neil, Ed, Robert Price. This is an interesting group of people. So please check their work out. It will be worth your while. And Medalia has actually came back to ask another question, or maybe make a comment. We should have known her importance when she wasn't identified by her father or husband, like everyone else. All right. I think good point. But I think, and to be fair, people never had surnames at that time. So they were usually named after where they came from. So Magdalene, I think it's Magdalene is an area.
It's a town,
so Bethany. So, so people didn't have surnames. Christ wasn't Jesus' surname, by the way. That's one funny joke from Bart Ehrman. But they were known for the places where they come from or they're born. But still, I think Medalia is right. She's depicted as an independent person. She's always alone in the scene. She's not accompanied by a chaperone or a brother or a father. She's always there on her own, standing in her
and she had money.
Own feet.
And they had money, and they say repeatedly the women took care of the men's needs, and and that included financially, and I don't think the implications they were prostitutes either. I think they just come from wealthy families.
That, or they could, and that's so demeaning. It's like as if women can only be valuable if they're involved in prostitution. I'm sure women can do other things. I'm not
trying to make that implication, but it is a quick way for women.
No, it's. I never understood that, because they could do other work, like they can do farming, they can do cleaning of homes, they can do whatever work they.
Well, they stole their weaving. Actually, women made a lot of money in the ancient world. All the weaving that women would do at home was a business. I mean, that's an industry, and they would sell that stuff. And the women were actually, the men would leave for like extended periods of time. They'd go to war, or they'd go on a trade journey, or take the animals someplace, whatever. The men would come and go, and the women were staying at home, and the women they were pretty active. They had businesses, and they would manage lands and manage businesses, and weaving, especially making of all these textiles, was a very much of a revenue generating source of income for all households. It was just something people did.
On the other hand, Jesus really not clear. We're not clear of what job he used to do. He's.
So where's the idea that he was a carpenter? I mean, is that? Yeah. Does it say that in the Gospels or not?
No, not really. I think it's because Joseph was one, and some sort of, and sometimes he's depicted as a shepherd. Whether I think it's more of a metaphor rather than an actual job.
Right. So we don't know where Jesus was between the age of 12 and the age of 30. Do you have any sense of where he was? Or any
No. From that incident in the temple, all the way from exactly right, from 12 to 30, he only appears suddenly. The John the Baptist situation, and for 3 years, he's doing so much work that I don't think he will take any other job on the side. I think he was devoted for those 3 years to spreading the kingdom of God. but maybe it's immaterial. Maybe he had a job, but maybe it wasn't important to be mentioned for some reason.
Or maybe he was traveling. Maybe, and I'm again speculating, but maybe I always liked this idea. I heard it a long time ago that that he'd gone to India in the intervening years, and he was like training as like a yogi.
Yeah.
So he's deeply immersed in Eastern traditions, and then comes back with some like hybrid mystical teachings. Some sort of neo Judaism or something. I don't know.
Yeah. And that's how curry was introduced to ancient Rome. You get all these different stories, and him and Thomas apparently gone to India.
Right, with Thomas.
Weird. Yeah.
Well, that's one thing with the Gnostic Gospels, especially the Gospel of Thomas, as you mentioned, the obvious comparisons to like Hinduism and Buddhism. Like when you read it, it reads like you're reading like a Buddhist text. And there's been a lot of commentary over the years that, Thomas has the legend is that he does go to India and that's where he dies. And so there's been a lot of commentary of what potential connections to India there is, and at what point in time those connections might have been made before or after Jesus, actually was there. And so there's clearly some kind of connection there, but it's very difficult to determine precisely the nature of the connection.
I mean, it doesn't have to be Thomas. We know that the Christians sort of started to travel around the world and trying to spread the word of God. I think exaggeration of them, the Holy Spirit sort of landing on them and speaking in tongues and languages of these countries that they've never been to before and stuff like that. I think it's far-fetched, but it's quite conceivable that missionaries have started to be active and they go and travel and trying to spread
yes, there
the
was
word
trade
of God.
routes all the way to India from the Near East. I mean, that goes way back. There's nothing new about that.
Yeah, so that's not weird or supernatural. I can completely understand that. But going back to the female's role, now let's imagine for a second. Now we know the men have taken over Christianity, and actually, I must say, Jesus's message was completely changed, and that's very evident by how Rome was going to be acting in. After the 3rd and 4th century, after Constantine and Theodosius have made Christianity to be the religion of the country, and it's taken over the world, and the population have started to convert. But then we can see now Christianity is completely being changed from its original message, and it's used as almost a weapon to conquer other nations. But what if Paul and Peter and all these men were not in the scene, and it's women? It's Mary Magdalene.
That's my story. What would Western civilization be like if women had always maintained a respected role? What if the notions of the Divine Mother had never been purged from our society? We would live in a very different world. We'd have a very different relationship with nature. We wouldn't have, Christianity is a very authoritarian religion, and we wouldn't necessarily have such centralized authority. Like maybe, our culture would be much more just decentralized, or maybe just some different authority would have come along at a different point. But, the Gnostics and the pagans both were like decentralized ideologies. They don't have a central authority. It's kind of like Protestantism. There's no central authority in Protestantism. Anyone can make their own church. Anyone can interpret scripture the only way you see fit. You don't really even need to read the scripture. If you want to go make a new church here in America, there's no rules about it, like how you interpret the Bible at all. So, and that's what the Gnostics and pagans had, at least in that regard, they have that much in common. There's no central authority. And so I think that would be an important distinction. You wouldn't have had the Catholic institution dominating, Europe all through the Middle Ages, which leads to some, pretty horrific stuff in terms of being intolerant and pretty ghastly in the treatment of women.
But we can also contrast that, Edward, from the past, because we know that the era pre men taking over completely and the machine of war is in action. that these were very placid sort of areas. You know, the agriculture.
in the
We have no
Neolithic,
evidence there were wars.
right. In the Neolithic, there's no evidence of wars or kings or slavery or any of these dominance hierarchies. And this is where, Marx and Engels get their ideas for communism and socialism from these old egalitarian cultures. And I do think that that is part of the ethic of underlying some of these counterculture, culture war stuff that's happening now, that at least there's a flavor of this. This is one of the undercurrents, is that people trying to break away from big authority structures, and trying to find more cooperative ways to live. I mean, it's like the hippies are always trying to do this kind of thing, build more communes, build more co-ops. All the prophets were busy in their youth. Some of them were. So yeah, I think that these old traditions can actually teach us a lot about how we might want to be. Like, we've sort of lost sense that we even can be cooperative. We've gotten so hung up on like authorities telling us what to do at all times that people have kind of lost the idea that they can think for themselves, and that you can actually have like a cooperative structure.
Do you think then, Ed, by doing that, we actually shot ourselves in the foot as the human race, by removing a certain balance between the male and female way of thinking? Because I think we're different. I think there's a slight difference in the way we approach things. Women tend to be a lot more political, a bit more patient, a bit more nourishing, and men can be decisive, they can be rash, they can be aggressive because of, the adrenaline and the things that were. But removing that balance that provided by the female part of us, because I think it's one divided into two, and as a result, humanity was imbalanced for quite some time. You've got leaning towards aggression so much, and not resolving conflict in a certain way that women would do. And imagine the amount of wars and amount of unnecessary killing would have been avoided if there was that balance.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree. I think we need to restrike some of that balance, and we need to bring back some of this, feminine notions into like the structure of how we think. One of the things is like circular thinking versus linear thinking. This is when I talk about environmental stuff, I talk about our big environmental problem is that we have a linear economy. We extract resources, we use them once, and then we dump them as garbage. And then we're surprised that we have like big holes in the ground over here and like big piles of pollution over there. But like that's in fact, what our economy is set up to do. We're set up to make holes in the ground and turn it into garbage. Whereas nature is circular system. It's a zero waste circular economy where every output feeds the next input, and there's no pollution, and it has endless growth. And this is like a maternal idea. This is exactly what these old nature-based traditions were doing, is that they were immersing themselves in nature and immersing themselves in the cycle of life. And I sincerely believe that in terms of solving our environmental problems, we need to reacquaint ourselves with the cycle of life and circular thinking principles. And there are solutions available for climate change that, that there are some lessons that we can apply to solving climate change, because I think there are solutions for climate change. But it is we can learn a lot of stuff from these old, how they thought, like how they thought about the mother, how they thought about that we're a part of nature, not separate from nature, and that means these cycles of life, death, and rebirth, as opposed to these cycles of immortality that the monotheists like to teach us, that everything's linear and immortal. It's two different ways of thinking.
Agreed. I think we'll do ourselves a favor. I think we don't need to be compassionate or feeling sorry for women. We actually just all have to do is being pragmatic and being, understanding that it's actually going to, if that balance is achieved, is going to benefit everyone, including men themselves.
Oh yeah, no, like holding women back is, this has got to be the number one critique of Islamic society, is like that they're holding their women back. It's like, come on, folks, like get with the program. Your women are half of like your resource base of your country. Like you're not tapping the full value of your society if you're not relying on women's intelligence and capabilities. So it's just going to hold back these cultures that aren't fully enabled.
They're literally shooting themselves in the foot by doing so.
100%.
Yeah.
So like, with my daughters, I just try to empower my daughters to be independent and, and like fully engaged in life and have no limitations. That's sort of how I approach it.
Ed, your new website, or I think revamped, it looks fantastic. I've told you
Thanks.
about the different topics, and if you want to, guys, in the description of the video there is a link to Ed's YouTube channel and website. Please check them out. But if you can take us through what are the main features of that website and what kind of topics we expect to see.
Yeah. So I'm adding material to it all the time. I'm going to be putting a article I just wrote on some of this climate change stuff on there, because that's actually near and dear to my heart as well. But at the moment, what we have on there is, if you scroll down a little bit, so you got this art by my friend Juan Hernandez, and it's an art and storytelling project. But there on the left, you can take a look at my book. And I've got, some excerpts from my book there, The History of the Goddess from Ice Age to the Bible. I've got Gnostic Mystery Jesus, which is a short story, which we were talking about. It's like a thought piece. And again, that's loaded with Juan's art. And I also wrote a more scholarly article talking about swoon theory and the idea that they could have faked his death. And then I've got links to some of those complete Gnostic Gospels, so you can read the whole thing. There's more of Juan's art. And then Epic of Ishtar is going to be a project I'm working on. And then I'll be updating the blog, getting my Substack. I'm adding some of my Substack articles to the website, and some of this more environmental stuff. Because one of the main things, so I was in renewable energy, and I still am, actually. I make my living in solar business right now. I've been in renewables for a long time. And as I was saying, I'm a big believer in a circular economy and zero waste as the key principles, as opposed to the strategy we have right now of 100% renewable energy. I'm in the solar business, but I don't actually believe that, wind and solar are going to run our entire economy. So I would like to have a different political message out there, but I was always struggling to get this message across because it's very like empirical. And it's like, I was sort of like, none of the environmental groups are going to hire me when I'm calling myself a pro natural gas environmentalist. So that was a problem for me. So I stopped doing that work. But then I came back to it when I realized that, and part of the reason why I got into this Asherah story was when I realized that these ancient religions were mythologically talking about the same circular economy principles that I'm talking about, and that I could like use these stories as a metaphor for explaining my environmental vision that is today. And that, as well as all this other culture war stuff that's going on too. And that was what got me so interested in the whole story of Asherah and these related goddesses, was that it's not just like theory or some like, abstract stuff from the past. Like, these cultural traditions never went away, and they've completely are still a part of our very heated aspects of our culture war right now. And that it really is very informative about the world we're living in right now if you understand these religious wars of the past, and understand that these religious wars never really ended, and they're still kind of being fought.
So, when you talk about circular use of resources, we're talking about sustainability, not out fishing, not out using the resources. So it's a long-term vision about making sure that our resources
Yeah,
sort of
our
last.
entire, as a basic principle, nature is a zero waste system. Every output feeds the next input, and there's no pollution, there's no garbage and waste in nature, right? And nature is able to achieve endless growth this way. The jungle never stops growing, because every time something dies, it becomes food for the next process. But that's not what human industry does. We're the opposite. We like nothing, everything we make just turns into toxic waste. I mean, like, just look around your room. Literally
Plastic.
every single object in your room 50 years from now is going to be toxic waste in a landfill.
Yeah.
And that goes for all the solar panels and wind turbines too. We need to figure out how to make stuff so that it doesn't turn into toxic waste. We need to learn how to model nature. And so that either means recycling, like material, like mechanical recycling, or it means stuff that's going to be deposited in nature needs to be good for nature. So if we're going to release stuff out into the air, soil, and water, it needs to be good for the air, soil, and water, and then it's okay to release it. And we need to learn how to do that. Otherwise, our industrial economy is the way it's built now is built to fail ecologically. Like it will fail. Like it's just a matter of time, because we're not following any ecological principles. Everything we're doing as an industrial economy all around the world and in every culture is violating ecology. And, as they say, nature bats last, and nature's going to have the final say. And she is going to kill us. Like she is going to kill us. Kali is coming. She's going to take, some big chunk of humanity until we learn our lesson. Basically, like it's something bad's going to happen one of these days.
Yeah, it's interesting how we act sort of an out of sight is out of mind. Like how we sort of exported our waste to third world countries, thinking, oh, that's in some other country, and therefore we don't have to worry about them. We forgot we live in just the one planet, and it's like spitting into the wind. It's going to come back and hit you in the face at some point.
Yeah, we can't just pollute our air, soil, and water and expect. But the real indicator for me is wildlife and species extinction, and the fact that we're having a mass extinction right now. This is the canary in the coal mine that we should all be very nervous about, because if all the wildlife is dying all around us, that is a bad sign for us. Like it means we're coming next. Like it's just, we can't like destroy poison on the landscape around us and expect to survive. Like something bad is going to happen. That's going to take a huge chunk of humanity with it. And so for me, species extinction and land use and ecosystem renewal absolutely should be the paramount concerns, over some of this bureaucratic techno policy stuff. The moon now has a wobble. Maybe it does, and maybe there's just forces at work that are, it's going to make it all a moot point anyway. We're just going to get hit by an asteroid, and all of our worries are,
It's fun fact: the moon moves away about 3.5 centimeters per year from Earth. But don't worry, it's not going to go out of whack, and it's still
it's just consistently moving farther away from us.
Yeah, 3.5 centimeter a year. But it still will stay in orbit. Even we're talking millions of years for it to happen. But then we have other issues like the death of our sun. There are so many issues. It's things are gonna we're doomed. But I still recall the Christopher Hitchens situation where he was talking about the sun dying at some point, and one of the guys just stood up from the spectators and in panic and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Hitchens, did you say 5 million years or 5 billion years?" He said, "No, 5 billion years." He said, "Oh, thank God." As if 5 million years was, that it was a worrying thing for him.
Well, unfortunately, it's probably the asteroids or this comet trail that we pass through we pass through twice a year or something.
Yeah. There was one recently, apparently, but it's passed.
Because I'm a believer in the Younger Dryas impact theory. I don't know. Are you familiar with it?
No.
All right. So the idea is that at the end of the last ice age, 12,800 years ago, we were hit by either a meteor or a comet or an asteroid or something into the North American ice caps, and that this is the cause of the mass extinction event that happens which we know for sure happened, because we have in the fossil record that all the wildlife gets killed off pretty much all at once. And so the new theory, the emerging science, is that it's still very controversial, is that we were struck by an object, and perhaps more than once, perhaps multiple objects, even centuries apart. But you can see the temperature charts in the Younger Dryas. This is, we are coming out of the ice age, and things have been melting, and then the temperatures go plunging down back into like freezing temperatures. There's a mass extinction event. It stays really cold for a couple centuries and then dramatically warms back up again, and then we go into the Neolithic, and that's when we get the Neolithic Revolution, is after this event. And so my argument is that this is where we get the flood stories, Noah's flood and the other flood stories, is that people look for evidence of gigantic floods in the past. I don't think they need to look for evidence of gigantic floods. I think they need to look for evidence of a mass extinction event. and that's what the story is about. Is the story is about a mass extinction event, and that event happens in the Younger Dryas, and that it leaves, the 10% of humanity that survives. Because again, we know from the fossil record that human populations were wiped out by like 90%. And so whatever scarred and traumatized and terrified people that survived this catastrophe, and it may have been bad for centuries. Like, we don't really know what was going on then, like for the immediate survivors, and how bad the weather was for how long, or what they did to survive. But eventually they come out when the weather finally improves, and they have these memories of the flood, and that there was a time before the flood and a time after the flood. And that becomes this cultural memory and this mythology that just lives on forever, because it was so traumatizing that it never gets forgotten.
Yeah, we know we're down to thousands at some point, and we've just made it.
Yeah, like they were hanging on by their fingertips, like it was a Mad Max type apocalyptic catastrophe where this handful of survivors are eking out survival in a cave or something. And then they come out of that and they know how to grow food. It's like they learned how to like sprout seeds or something while they're hiding in caves or something like that.
Yeah, and that was linked to female fertility, and females were pioneers in that era.
When they come out, they're absolutely celebrating fertility. They're celebrating plant growth. They're celebrating agriculture, and all of their religion is totally centered on making plants grow. How do we make plants grow like religious zealots? Which is kind of what I think we need for climate change. Like, I think that we don't need a bunch of technology. What we need is to restore ecosystems and make plants, restore ecosystems at a continental scale, and basically make plants grow like religious zealots. Like, that's what we need to do. And then we can actually absorb our emissions.
The COVID thing has been a horrible thing, but the couple of positive things is actually reduced the carbon dioxide emission. It reduced the movement of humans around the globe in terms of air traffic and supply chain logistics.
COVID did, yeah. For a moment, it did that.
Yeah, a lot of things have recovered over the last 2-3 years, and people, I think, mindset has changed a little bit. I don't think people on the back of this want to work from 9 to 5 days a week anymore, and being in traffic jams. I think we know better. I think I
agree with that. Like, there's definitely been a shift in work habits. People are accustomed to working from home now. A lot of people in America are quitting their low rent, their low wage jobs. It's like, working for $12 an hour just doesn't pay the rent. So it's kind of a waste of time. So why not just like go do anything else? Like, go be a creator on the internet, or go just about anything other than working your slave labor at some corporate retail place. So people are quitting those jobs. Like you said, they're kind of got fed up with commuting if they don't need to. I don't have to commute for my job really very much anymore, so that's nice.
Yeah, and all of these maybe we should be heading towards an era where technology will only be used when needed, not as a statement, or because at some point technology was the thing. You got to have technology, otherwise you'd be perceived to be backwards, or and it's costing us a lot of issues, not just on the environmental level, but on the social level, where you end up going to dinner with friends and few kids, and none of the people are engaging in the conversation. Everybody's on their phones, and it's such a sad scene.
Yeah, it is. It's very difficult to deal with, and I'm as guilty as anyone. It's very tricky business. It's very tricky for parenting. It is, I wish I had a good solution, because I tend to be an addict as well on electronics. And I think that they're only getting more integrated into our lives.
There's actually a solution. There's some restaurants now, when you enter, there is the phone caddy thing, where you have to actually to put the phone away. You're not allowed to use your phone, and everybody puts the phone in the center of the table. You can see it, but you can't touch it for the duration of the dinner or the lunch you're having. And it's a fantastic thing.
I think it's a good custom, like it's just a good like etiquette. If we could all learn to do that. I'm going to a concert and they're going to make us put our phones in a bag so we can't take pictures and stuff. And I'm fine with that too. But yeah, I think that could be a good bit of etiquette if we could all learn to like, hey, we're all just going to collectively put our phones on silent in the middle of the table.
Actually, Immanuel Kant talked about it in ethics and talked about being addicted to stimulants, and that's quite unethical. Being, so those people sitting on their Facebook, refreshing every few seconds, waiting for something to come in, so they can be angry about or they can be happy about. We cannot generate our own ideas coming from our own head. We need outside stimuli to be enraged or to be happy, and keep refreshing the news to see what's coming in.
Yeah.
And it's made us sort of poor in imagination. We're waiting for things to come into our brain so we can react rather than generate ideas outwards.
And it's clearly agitating our society. I mean, all these political revolutions are happening all over the world, are clearly being, enhanced by social media. And it's a phenomenon everywhere. We saw it in America with Trump, but that's just one manifestation of it. And then also, I do worry about what it's doing to our thought patterns, and especially for children, for this youth of today that are growing up on the phones. What's it going to do to their full-on like synapses and like how their brain patterns develop? We really don't know. I know for me, like I hardly ever read books anymore because I'm always reading all day long on the internet. And so reading an entire book is like difficult to get through. And I used to read books all the time. So that's changed.
Yeah, well, I tend to do Audible now because I can actually listen to a full book while I'm doing other things. So it's an interesting evolution that we're all going through, to be honest. So Ed, I just want to finish up by going back a little bit to the main topic, and that reimagination of the word where women, I'm not going to say dominant because I think some
No, I don't think it was ever dominance. I think it's egalitarian. It's equality.
Yes, and that's good enough, and that's brilliant. Because some people might sort of listen to us and say, "Oh, well, are you advocating the balance to be tipped the other side?" And I'm going to say, no, that's not what we're saying. But we're talking about that balance that needs to be achieved. But right now, what do you think in the last 100 years? With all the women rights and feminism movements and women right to vote and equality, and a lot of conversation about salaries and women needs to be paid exactly as men. Do you think we're hitting on the right track?
Sure, definitely. But what I think the big picture of that is that how much that change is a function of technology and the Industrial Revolution, and those changes get kicked off. Also, the end of slavery, all get kicked off when it's the change in how technology changes our day-to-day work lives and changes our day-to-day, sort of work, home life routines, that gives women the opportunity to start advocating for their rights. And as technology continues to shift, the space is opening up more and more and more for women. And I think the internet actually opens up huge opportunities for women to be engaged in all sorts of different new fields that would not have been, partly just because new professions are being invented. And I would love to see more women in tech. Computer programming came out of mechanical weaving. Like the inventions of like computer programming was built on models from older mechanical looms that go back to the Middle Ages. And so the original card punch cards that they used to write the very first computer programs, you know what I'm talking about? Like back in the 1960s, like those were invented originally for how they would pattern, the quilting on on a loom for weaving on a mechanical loom. They went back centuries before that. And so, and weaving was always women's work. And so I feel like there's this connection where women could follow this trend, this long old pattern. And as you mentioned, women are good at communication, that getting more women into coding and getting more women into, building the internet and building these networks could play a big role in getting our society back towards a more egalitarian fashion, that we need more women in tech and more women in programming and influencing the broader society.
What do you think of Jordan Peterson and his analogy in saying, men are interested
I would love
in
to talk to Jordan Peterson. I don't agree with him, but I do think that he gets over his skis and he said some weird things. Like some of the stuff he says is off the wall. So I'm not trying to defend everything he says, but he does at least attempt to articulate the traditional, like Western patriarchal patrician worldview, all the kind of stuff that I was raised with. Jordan Peterson really reminds me of my father a lot. And he very much speaks from the same worldview my father had. And it was a very old school patrician, alpha male kind of world. And there was a certain set of values and morals and ethics and traditions that came out of that worldview that were very well developed and deeply thought about, Western traditions and Western philosophies. And Jordan Peterson, sometimes he does it better and sometimes he doesn't do it so well, but he's trying to speak to those traditions. And I really hear these same messages I got in Catholic school, or messages I got in these various all boy environments I was in as a kid, from churches and stuff, and from father figure types, and from my own father. I just hear all these echoes when I hear Jordan Peterson. And
But
so I just want to finish. I would love to talk to him about the mother and how my mother, or my goddess, is the mother of his God. And tell him and talk about all this Bible stuff that he likes to talk about, because I'm here to tell you, Jordan, I got a different interpretation on all these stories for you.
I don't think he's real Christian. Yeah, I don't think he's real Christian. I mean, if you ask him if he's Christian, he's gonna say to you, it depends what do you mean by Christian.
He's enlightenment. He's Western Enlightenment, which is one part atheist and one part Protestant. The Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation are two sides of a coin, in my opinion. And these are the classical Western values that draw from both traditions. And he's not really he doesn't call himself a devout Christian, but he talks about the Bible a lot. And he talks about how these archetypal stories shape our culture. Yeah. And I see where he's coming from with what he's saying. These stories do shape our culture. And that's exactly what I'm trying to say, is we can have different stories if we want to shape our culture in a different way.
Yeah, but behind the alpha male conversation, it's all good and nice. But he's one of the most vulnerable speakers out there, and he often breaks down into tears, And so I think it's almost like depicting Nietzsche, where he talks about the Übermensch and Superman, but deep down Nietzsche was a broken, sick man, trying to create an alter ego like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde out there for himself. But I think he's fighting many demons. Intellectual, nonetheless. I would be interested in chatting with him. But the topic of men and women, the differences, he said men are interested in things while women are interested in people. That's why you find a lot engineering is dominated by men, nursing and looking after older people is dominated by women. Is he right?
I think more or less, yeah. I think that there's an attempt nowadays to really deconstruct gender roles to meaninglessness, and I don't think that's. There's a lot to be said for gender bending, and transgender people play an important role in society, I believe. But there are also reasons why we have certain traditional genders, and I do believe in a sacred feminine that is something that men have no power on. The stuff that's the space of the sacred feminine is stuff that men can't do, and that is, reproduction is the most obvious one, but there's other aspects of, the way women think that is just sort of your typical guy. And again, there's gender bending. So there's men that can tap into it, but there is sort of a mythic ideal, if you will, both on the feminine and masculine side.
Yeah.
That gender bending allows you to play in both parts, but at the same time, those magnetic poles still exist.
But I agree, maybe in the majority, but you can still see now male nurses who are not gay and female UFC fighters who are not lesbian. It's becoming a thing.
Yeah, it's not all about gay sex or anything. But as far as it's funny, I've got daughters and a son, and we raised them in a pretty he's talking about Peterson. Yeah, I mean, Peterson has some. You mentioned Peterson has some demons. I 100% agree with you. The guy, he has some demons, and they're on display. He spends a lot of time on camera, and
I think that's part of the charm. I think that I like people with demons. They're more complex. They're more interesting to engage with. I don't like people who are just so predictable. It makes it interesting and exciting to speak to somebody who can go bananas on you in any second.
So anyway, I was just gonna say, we raised my daughters and my son in the same household, and the girls were such stereotypical girls, and my son was such a stereotypical boy, and there was nothing you could do to like. It didn't matter what toys we gave him. I mean, my boy acted like a boy, and my girls acted like girls, and there was nothing you were gonna do about it. And at the same time, if you had a child who was totally like presenting as trans at age 3, I think that's legitimate too. And like, I get that. Like, I think that's, a reality for some people. I don't think it's a lot of people, but I do think it's reality for some people.
Yeah, completely agree. Ed, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Would you like to end with any pearls of wisdom, wrapping this up together?
I don't know if I got any pearls of wisdom. But yeah, just check out LostGoddess.io. Check out my work. Please subscribe to my Substack and the YouTube channel. There's just getting it kind of up and running right now, getting more material out there. So, and I'm hoping to be spending more time on podcasts. So just hopefully tune in, and if and try and support the work. And I really appreciate it. And I hope to talk to you some more, Hanney, and talk to all the crowd of folks.
We'll definitely have future conversations as you develop more work, and I'm sure you'll be creating more interesting analogies that challenge the status quo. Thank you very much, Edward.
Thank you, Hanney. Appreciate it. Anytime. I'll do it again.
Thank you, folks. That's the end of our show today. I am going to be appearing in probably about 10 hours, and I am going to schedule an open conversation tonight. So see you later.